I believe that organising or planning for a border poll here in Ireland at the moment would be a profound mistake because the agenda of how we manage Brexit in so many different manifestations has to be delivered and allowed to settle on our island first. And I believe to go down the path of making the case that Irish unity is a solution to those difficulties would be a really profound error we should avoid on this island.
Welcome to Ireland Unfiltered. We're not in the studio today, we're actually in the Department of Finance, where we came to find some time in the schedule of the Minister for Finance, Paschal Donohoe. But it was worth it. It's a fascinating interview with probably the deepest thinker in Irish politics, a man who has thought a lot about populism, about the rise of populism, and as we've seen in recent times in London, in the House of Commons, through the whole Brexit debate, how that is an urgent issue that isn't going away, that populism and the triggers for populism are something we all are aware of with fascination sometimes, but also watch on in horror at some of the things that are occurring in the UK. And we talked a lot about that because Paschal Donohoe is also, I believe, the most nuanced speaker on Anglo-Irish relations in Irish public life and certainly in Irish politics. Minister, thank you so much for doing Ireland Unfiltered. And thank you for inviting us into your office, which is now our auxiliary studio space in Dublin.
Well, Dion, it's always available to you. Maybe we can look at some early morning broadcasts from here. And I have to say, the setup that we have here of two comfy chairs with some strong, bright lighting behind us is giving me all kinds of ideas for how I conclude the budget. So you might leave some of your kit behind me when you go.
It's like an interrogation room, is it?
Interrogation room could be stretching it a bit too far. And now I'm feeling, now that you feel like that, I have a growing sense of foreboding for what the rest of the interview will bring.
No.
But you have given me some ideas, you have.
I want to ask you first about events in the UK, just recent events, because as somebody who has written and spoken about populism and says yet you remain optimistic about the future, how do you feel when you look at recent events in Westminster and you see women MPs standing up and imploring the Prime Minister to moderate his language because of death threats they're receiving?
So I lived in the UK for a long time. And I go backwards and forwards to the UK for lots of personal reasons, not to mention work reasons. And when I look at what's unfolding in the UK at the moment, while I'll leave aside the detail of what's happening for a moment, there's two things that keep on striking me, Dion, as I watch in particular the events of the last few days. The first one is it reminds me so much of that language matters, that tone matters in politics. And I've been arguing this for a little while here in Ireland and making the point in different places. But it appears so important now that tone and the use of words isn't just a way of how you describe politics. It's a constituent of politics. And I look at the effect now that is having in the UK. And then the second thing I'm always reminded of, which we told a lot about here in Ireland between 2008 and 2011 and 2012, is that political order and how you organise politics matters so much. And as great as economic challenges sometimes can be, if you lose that sense of how politics is organised, and lots of people begin to feel that politics doesn't represent them, the consequences of it are so huge. But despite all of that, I do remain optimistic that in the UK and definitely here, there are ways through this because history teaches us that.
But when you say that, that words matter, like that's a point of view that people are saying, but the people in power are using that, but they're using that to ignite divisions and to railroad through what they want to get through.
And unfortunately, that has become a tone and an issue, not just only for those in government in the UK. And they would argue, and I can understand the case, that they're looking to represent a particular view. But you've now heard and hear the normalisation of language and words that I don't believe we should let happen here in Ireland, and an approach about politics that I think there are better ways of finding. And I'm, of course, if you want to find out the best kind of wisest writer and stuff like that, it is, of course, an English writer, George Orwell. And he wrote a fantastic essay called Politics and the English Language, at a time in which England and Britain and indeed the world was grappling with all kinds of different threats. And he made the point that kind of language can corrupt thought and thought can corrupt language. And while I wouldn't use the word corruption for what is going on at all, because again, that uses a word that I don't think is fair to the issue of how people are represented in politics, the fusion of language and thought is more than how you describe politics. It defines what politics is. And I think the stakes are high now.
And when you say that, during 2008, 2011, we lost sight of certain aspects of the sort of political project and how to bring people with us, is that an ongoing problem? Because, I look at stuff you've written about how, sort of centrists maybe were taken by surprise by Brexit and Trump, and yet we're still taken by surprise because Boris Johnson is now Prime Minister, who maybe nobody saw. I wouldn't say you envisaged that happening a couple of years ago. So what is the lesson there, like, about how can a moderate voice respond to a world where it seems that in any situation, like the extremes just keep on pushing through.
And context is all in politics, because you can only evaluate a proposition or progress against the backdrop of how politics is being conducted and framed. And to your point, what are the lessons for centrist politics for what is happening at the moment? I think there are two. The first one is that if you can't continually ensure that people feel they have a stake in how an economy is being organised and working for them, or if they don't have a stake, that they might have one in the future, the consequences for politics and then for an economy are profound. And then the second issue and the other big lesson is that, like, our institutions matter so much, but you can never take them for granted. And let me give you an example of it. The Irish voting system, the electoral system that we have, that has been criticised for so long for engendering what some would argue to be a parochialist approach to politics. From my point of view, it's proved one of the great strengths of what politics has gone through here in Ireland. And the reason why I say that, Dion, is that it is impossible to stay elected in Ireland only representing a particular part of a community or a particular part of a constituency. And that leads to an intimacy and a sense of connectivity between representative politics here in Ireland and communities that I think sometimes we understate.
So it enables people to feel that they do have that stake.
I hope you're right in saying that, but I'm not sure that's always the case. Okay. But certainly what I think is the case then is that it's necessary for people in public life to be always connecting and always reaching in and always saying, I have to represent all parts of a constituency. And I don't know if you've ever been, I'm sure you have ever been in the UK, for example, when a general election is happening. You can go through many different constituencies and not have a sense that an election is happening. Because their voting system leads to particular parties always representing particular constituencies nearly all of the time. The fact that we don't have that here in Ireland isn't a vulnerability.
Right. And do you think that, like, when you talk about that stake, do you think globally there wasn't enough done at the time of the crash to do that? Because I was listening to a podcast, The Wilderness, the John Favreau podcast. Yep. And there was Heather McGhee, who was part of one of the Obama think tanks at the time of the crash. She said that they never did enough to restore the balance of power between Wall Street and the rest of the economy.
I think that sense of balance and the sense of having a stake is at the heart of the debate that we face. And it's one that I grapple with every day in this room and in this building. And like to give it an Irish context, there's always a debate going on about the budgetary choices that I make. Should we have a surplus? Should we have a deficit? Is the surplus too big? Is the projected deficit too big? And a question that I've always reflected on is that if we can't show to citizens that a growing or stable economy is capable of addressing issues that matter to them, how will they feel when we have to encounter the next difficulty? And the counter argument to some of the arguments that are put to me are, for example, if we had a surplus, let's say, of 1.5%, but we were still only building 5,000 or 8,000 homes a year, how would we feel about that? If we had a larger surplus, but we had investment levels that hadn't grown since the crisis, how would we feel about that? And that sense of connectivity and that sense of having a stake, if that is lost, the consequences are really big. And to give it an American slant, like if I look at the amount of liberals that would feel very disenfranchised by President Trump, the symmetry of that is the number of conservatives who would have felt very disenfranchised under President Obama.
But when you talk about something like housing there, like the sense of urgency that many people feel about the housing crisis, is it hard? Like, do you understand why they feel that maybe the kind of middle ground way doesn't address these things as quickly as they need it to be addressed?
I absolutely understand why, and I've always felt kind of very strongly about this because of the kind of constituency I represent in Dublin Central, in which housing difficulties, whether it be the public homes, whether it be rental difficulties, have been prevalent now since I got into politics. And that has really guided things that I've looked to do, like, for example, getting the state now to manage land banks, to not only provide homes in it themselves, but also influence how other land bank owners feel about their land. It's influenced how much huge extra money that we've put into public housing. But I absolutely take the point that if you are in rental accommodation, seeing your rent go up, or if you are in a housing list for 8 years or 9 years, me telling that citizen that 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 out of every home that will be built in Ireland this year will be either built directly by the state or enabled by the state sounds hollow. And it goes back to the questions you put to me at the start of the interview regarding how can you maintain faith when progress is incremental, and the gap between life as a consumer and how fast that is and the demands that we all have as citizens, and trying to bridge the gap.
I want to ask you about something you said earlier about the tone. Why, and how important tone is in politics, why when I listen to you talking about Brexit and the relationship between Ireland and England, do I feel I'm listening to a very different tone to when I hear other government politicians or Fine Gael politicians talking about it?
Well, God, I guess I should turn the question back to you and ask, why do you feel like that? Because in terms of my outlook or view on the matter, I would feel would be very much aligned with the Taoiseach and Taoiseach. What I'm always grappling with is the kind of different parts of my own identity. Like I feel so strongly that I'm European and Irish, and they don't contradict each other. And I lived in the UK for a long time, and I'm backwards and forwards over there, and I'm really vested in that part of our relationship as well. And it's entirely possible, Dion, that the next great political project, once we cross the current hurdle that we're on now, is at what that new equilibrium is and how we can develop that politically, and that could be coming at us.
Because I'm interested in that, because what I feel is, because you live there, I lived in London for a long time, and I felt that relationship between Ireland and England was sort of in the last, before Brexit, between 2011 especially, it was settled.
Yeah.
And I thought, England was a great place for me. I met my wife is English, like your wife is English. And it meant a lot to me. And my son was born there. And so to see this fracture is sometimes not inexplicable, because you talked about it, the old impulses are still there. But When I hear politicians talking about comparing, we all know what the British politicians have said, and some of it has been reprehensible at times. But when you hear politicians comparing Boris Johnson to Cromwell, when somebody says it's like speaking, that's the kind of thing I would tell my 6-year-old daughter. Mm-hmm. Like, is that helpful in maintaining the tone you're talking about?
Well, look, there have been a lot of moments of difficulty and a lot of moments of pressure over the last number of years in relation to how we manage the difficulties that we have. And I really feel that those who are centrally involved in this, politically and economically, including myself, have got the tone as right as well as we can. Mm. But I think you are identifying an important point here, which is that we do need to look at what our better angels are here. Mm. And we need to kind of guide ourselves into a different use of language and a different tone in dealing with this matter. Because the strategic truth for Ireland is that even in a no-deal Brexit setting, our relationship with the United Kingdom is so important. And because of the shared agenda that we both have, for example, with relation to the stability of Northern Ireland, mm-hmm. because of the shared agenda that we have, for example, in relation to the Irish community living in the UK and the English community living here, it's always going to lead back to how can we get a new normal. But like we have been here before.
Right.
And, you and I were probably living in the UK maybe roughly at the same time. As relationships were normalised post the Good Friday Agreement, as we were getting ready for that golden period of 2011, 2012. And great politicians with great thought and great skill who were immersed in this over decades reimagined what a relationship could look like. And I honestly think the level of challenge we face now is nowhere near what they faced then. And we are capable of working our way through this. And in the engagement that I've had with people like the new Chancellor of the UK, I have a lot of engagement with a lot of British politicians in all political parties. Like, they get this as well.
Do they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. From dealing with them, they appreciate the subtlety and value of what we have. Now, look, I don't want to overstate it either. I'm not in regular contact with Nigel Farage, obviously,
okay.
And the kind of politicians that I'd engage with are probably cut from the same cloth as me, but there's enough of them.
But is there enough of them in the Conservative government at the moment, do you think?
Yes, I think there's enough people in the Conservative government who feel like this and in the Conservative Party. But it's also true to say that the nature of conservatism in the UK and the proposition that is the British Conservative Party is changing in front of our eyes. But this has happened to them before as well. And
do you think the events of the recent days have made it even less likely that a deal can be reached? Because, again, people have said how Boris Johnson behaved in the House of Commons is going to make it very difficult to get the votes of the Labour MPs that he needs.
I believe an agreement can be reached. I believe it's possible for this to happen. But I think we're in a period now of real unpredictability in terms of what could happen in British politics. Will there be another general election? When that might happen? And if I have learned anything as a politician, and I learn new things every day, like elections are inherently unpredictable. And if an election happens in the UK, well, one will, but when? It would take somebody with quite the crystal ball now to be able to determine what's going to happen in it.
I was listening to somebody on the BBC last night saying that the EU side of things now, and you would know this better than anyone, the EU are now preparing for what they consider to be years, if not decades, of turbulence in the UK.
Have you become a Newsnight addict as well,
Well,
Dion?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. We're back at that period. I remember for a while I couldn't go to bed without watching Tonight with Vincent Brown here in Ireland. And now every night I'm turning on Newsnight to see what's going on. Look, this goes back to a theme we just touched on a moment ago, which is that in any setting, our relationship with the UK and what might unfold there is now ongoing. It's going to be ongoing. And the parallel I would draw is the peace process was never a peace project. It was always a process. And why was it called a process? Is because it was ongoing. And when we get through this phase of Brexit, because at some point we will, The next part of it is equally daunting. And I know from talking to my colleagues and friends in the European Union, this is something that we're all putting an awful lot of thought into, which is, what does the future look like? And like a lot of, you'll recollect the letter that Prime Minister Johnson sent to President Donald Tusk, where he outlined his views about the backstop. Another part of that letter outlined a very different economic model for the United Kingdom, an economic model that saw divergence from the European Union as a source of competitiveness. And he described that, quote unquote, as being central to our democracy. And the playing out of all of that and what that will mean for us is part of the new agenda that we're going to have to set here in Ireland.
You don't have, you say nobody can foresee the future in these times, but do you see a deal? Like, do you see a deal before October 31st?
I think it is possible that there could be one before October the 31st, but clearly the clock is ticking now with even greater intensity. But do I believe an agreement is possible after that point? Yes, I do, because with goodwill and imagination, it is possible to look at ways in which an agreement can be found. But there are limits to that. And, we have outlined our key needs and what we need to see happen. And they're the parameters within which the European Union will be conducting those discussions.
So post a no deal, there could be a deal. So the idea that the no deal isn't really a no deal anyway.
Well, this is something the Taoiseach has said on a number of occasions, and he's absolutely right about this. And his line of thought is kind of, I think, always worth developing on this point, because what he's saying is that, let's say a no deal happens, and we're all working hard to try and avoid that happening. It's not the end of anything. The issues that need to be dealt with in relation to the future relationship in relation to this island are still then there. But it's the context within which we then have to approach them is completely different. And
much worse.
A lot more challenging. And, it's a matter for debate regarding how the negotiation equilibrium will shift at that point. And we'll only know if we get to that point. But like the Taoiseach made the point that he'd heard people like, I think, Nigel Farage talk about a clean break. Like in a project of this scale, there is no such thing as a clean break. Once we work our way through this gap, all of the issues are going to be there and will need to be addressed again. But the background will be completely different.
And when you say it'd be by different, how do you envisage it?
Well, if we're in a no-deal setting, the economic environment evidently completely changes. We are at a point at the moment of a moderation in economic growth. Whether that moderation is pointing to something more difficult is not apparent yet at the moment, but it could be. I think if we were to move into a no-deal Brexit situation, that would pose an immediate shock to the British economy, to the Irish economy, and a bit of a less one to the European economy, but still a shock. So, for example, then we would be approaching the issues you and I have just discussed in the context of worsening economic circumstances.
And a border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, as Jean-Claude Juncker said again this week.
Well, what Jean-Claude Juncker said is that in the absence of, you heard the interview, he made the point, in the absence of an agreement and in the absence of the backstop, that creates a whole set of really big challenges for us. Because then the challenge that we will have here in Ireland will be, if you look at what is the heart of our economy, the heart of our economy is about exporting. It's about our relationship with the single market. And in those kind of circumstances, then we need to be able to give assurances, for example, to a French shopper, that the lamb that is coming out of Ireland to be exported to France isn't Welsh lamb coming through Northern Ireland. But these are matters that we can only deal with if we're approaching or in a no-deal setting. But they are going to be a challenge.
But can you explain something? This might be a stupid question, but does that sort of highlight the limits of the EU's commitment to the Irish peace process? Because at some point there is a biting point where the single market trumps the peace process. Is that what happens there?
I think if we get to that point, the appreciation and understanding of the European Union has for the peace process will continue to be clear. And if anything, I'd kind of flip your question slightly on its head, in that many have argued for many years that Europe will move away from Ireland and Europe will not offer the solidarity to Ireland that it has. And we are now many years down the path, and that has not happened. You hear Chancellor Merkel, you hear President Macron talk about the peace process here in Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement. So if anything, I'd make the counterpoint to you that the level of support that the European Union has offered Ireland and our political needs with regard to the Good Friday Agreement has surpassed the expectations of many.
Do you ever think you would have preferred the life of a writer to the life of a politician when you've got events like this?
No. And I have a great love of reading and of books, and during my younger moments thought this might be something that I would pursue, but life took a different path, and I wouldn't do anything else but this.
People would find it strange. Like, explain to me where you see the kind of overlap between, like, because that was your first ambition, to be a writer, and you wrote a novella. Oh
God, I did. Yeah, my God, I hope you haven't read it now.
I couldn't find it. I've read.
You'd have to search long and hard, Dion, to find it. I look, as a teenager and young adult, it's something I thought I wanted to do. But when I started going to college then, and I ended up studying economics, things just took a different path. But I was talking to a colleague of mine yesterday who's a civil servant, Ronan Hessian, and he's just published a fabulous novel called Leonard and Hungry Paul. Okay. A wonderful, beautiful comic book. And Ronan used to be head of corporate tax policy for Ireland and for this department. Okay. And as I was leaving him yesterday, Ronan said to me, he said, a bit of advice for you. He said, don't wait till you've given up your day job before you begin writing. Now, alas, that's not advice I'm going to be able to take, I think.
Okay. But you would look at it to do it in the future again?
I think at a point in the future, if God knows what the future will bring for me, I do want to set pen to paper. I don't think there'll be anything kind of fiction, though, or fictitious. But I have a few thoughts about all we've gone through. Whether anybody would want to read them or not is another matter.
Boris Johnson wrote a novel. Have you read that one?
I think the title had many versions in it.
72 versions.
I hope I won't disappoint you or him if I tell you I haven't.
But it might show that, not all novelists have great empathy or compassion.
Whatever creative impulses I have are unlikely to yield a work like that.
That's a very diplomatic answer. Talk to me a bit about when you were growing up then, because you had asthma. And I saw you when you were Minister for Sport, you talked about how that was something that excluded you from participating in sport. Did you spend, were you sick a lot? Did you spend a lot of time alone as a child, like reading? Was that something that you did?
I wasn't sick a lot, but asthma and growing up with asthma was definitely a big influence in my younger life, because up until we could find the kind of right medication to kind of stabilise us and then get me to kind of where I am now, which is in the dim and distant background of life, it was a big deal for me. And like I can always remember being in PE in primary school and secondary school, and like I just couldn't participate in the way others could. And like I was so lucky when all of this was happening to have these fabulous PE teachers who always appreciated that. And I never felt lonely, but I definitely didn't feel part of that group. And I have a kind of a vivid memory from kind of childhood. I went to St. Declan's, this great secondary school in Cabra, in the middle of my constituency now. And there used to be a big race that went around a park called the Bogies, the John Paul Park in Cabra. And it was kind of a big thing that was done every year in school to do 2 laps of it. And I just couldn't do it because of my asthma. And there was never a problem with it. Always supported by my teachers, always supported by my schoolmates. But I remember the last year in school, and I said, I'm going to finish this thing. And I finished it. And I can always remember coming around the final lap, just still limping to finish the thing off. And my teacher, Mr. McLaughlin, had lined up all of the class to cheer me in as I came in. And it taught me, a kind of completed my understanding of sport, all that did, in that reminded me what it's like not to be able to do it. And then that was a big deal for me when I ended up being Minister for Sport. But it also showed to me just how sport is it levels you and lifts you all at the same time, because everybody's the same on it. And that's stuck with me ever since.
And when you, did that develop then when you had your kids? Was like you're a Tottenham fan? Was that something you had as a child, or was that something you got when you went to the UK or through your kids?
That was a particular ailment that I contracted in family life.
Right, okay.
Which has been more persistent than I would have expected. And I got it well before I went to the UK or to London. And it's, despite various forms of treatment, has not left me, Dion.
Right. It's a
so
tough
obviously
time.
I was getting knocked out of the Cabra, the League Cup there during the week was another low moment, despite the appearance of an young Irish fan on the pitch.
Troy Parrott.
Yeah. So I'm kind of growing a little bit despairing of this analysis that the plights of our squad are due to Christian Eriksen. I think we need to move into a different space quickly now.
But you're very hopeful about Troy Parrott, I'd imagine.
I'm really hopeful, and I haven't been in the new stadium yet for all kinds of different reasons, but I think we do have a great squad and we have a great coach, but the hangover from the Champions League final, I think, is pretty enduring at the moment.
Why did you come back from England?
Because I never saw myself staying over there for good, actually.
Right.
And I always saw it as something that I wanted to do for a while. And I ended up being there for around 6 years. And then the company I was working for then offered me a role in Ireland. So it kind of all came together really well. And
your wife is English. Was she was happy to come back here as well?
Yeah, we've been back here now for many, many years. And Phibsborough and Dublin, and it's home.
And is that again something that informs how you feel about what's happening right now? Because I know you've maintained that the government are speaking, the tone is acceptable and all that kind of thing. But in a wider society, I don't know how you feel about this. My wife is English. We still live in England just up until Brexit, and she voted Remain, and she's appalled by what she sees there. But sometimes when I see some of the commentary here, I hope she doesn't think that's addressed to her. That's personal.
I'm really aware of it. I'm also really aware that if you're a Leave voter in the UK, about how they feel about their future, how they feel about their country, how they feel about the relationship with Ireland. Like in the long arc of history, all these things will really matter. And in the long prospect of what is yet to approach, these are impulses and emotions that will yet matter in the future. And that is why us finding an equilibrium between the journey that we're on now as a European state and as members of the European Union, and where the United Kingdom are going to end up, is the new project now that beckons. And everything that happens between now and them leaving the European Union will ultimately be seen against that wider kind of a horizon. And that's really on my mind. It's really on my mind economically when I hear Boris Johnson, Prime Minister Johnson, speak during the week about regulatory divergence in financial services and biotechnology has been areas that really matter to him. That alone for us is a signal of the kind of things we're going to have to think about.
In what way?
Because up to this point there has been, without getting kind of too obtuse on it all, there's been a common rule book. And what a common rule book means is there has been a commitment that we'll all play by the same technical standards and the same regulations. And under Prime Minister May's administration, there was a commitment to dynamic alignment, which meant if the rules within the European Union changed, the rules within the United Kingdom would change alongside them. that is not on the agenda of the current government. So, for example, if you look at what that means for our economy, all I'm saying at the moment is that is now an open question for the UK. And if they were to take a different approach, for example, in relation to regulations in their labour market, in relation to standards and how they would regulate financial services, or, for example, in relation to how they would manage data, that in turn means that would have consequences for us here in Ireland. But the one thing I'm crystal clear about is competitiveness for us in the future will not be about matching what would be happening elsewhere, will not be about doing the same thing. We'll have to think about how we can look after our economy in a way that's different to that.
And will there be a price to be paid for the loyalty of the EU? You know, people have talked about corporation tax and things like that. Do you think that's something that will affect Ireland?
No, I don't. And I can say this as somebody who's in the middle of that very kind of arena all of the time. And I don't believe that will happen. I've heard now for many years the prediction that at some point a price will be abstracted or extracted, I should say. I've heard many make that prediction. It has not happened up to this point. I don't believe it will. I was out in the courtyard of Merrion Square. I was actually in this building with the French Finance Minister, Bruno Le Maire, and Bruno Le Maire said these are different things. And the reason they're different is Brexit cuts to the heart of the European Union. The European Union is a political construct. And this goes to the idea of if a country then decides to leave that club, should a country who decides to remain in be significantly politically disadvantaged as a result of that exit? And if you're in Estonia, or if you're in Lithuania, do you have the same grasp of the border issues, for example, as we would have? Of course you don't. But do they understand that argument about what happens if a big country or a big neighbour decides to leave or act in a different way? They understand that in a really vivid way. And that's cutting to the heart of the reason why we're getting the support that we are.
And it also cuts to the heart of the profound misunderstanding about Brexit from the Leave side during the campaign and subsequently.
I think so. And look, I've tried to make this point in the United Kingdom in various different ways and in different meetings. And this cuts to the heart of the very different relationship between Ireland and the European Union and that of the UK and the European Union. You know, when I sit around the Council of Ministers table, which I've been very privileged to do now for Ireland for nearly 6 years, and I sit around this big table with the Irish flag in front of me or Ireland in a plaque, I'm sitting around with all my colleagues. For me, for Ireland, I think that is an example of us projecting and strengthening our sovereignty through sharing it. It's evident now that there's been a big tradition in English politics who's felt the exact opposite. And that's all played out to where we are today. I
was looking before you came in at The Economist. You have the open there from 1965. And you could, if you saw some of the quotes in it, you would think it was from 2019. It's about Britain's relationship with Europe. And the same tensions are there.
Isn't it just? And in fact, in my office next door, I have a little paperback book near my desk that's now 50 years old. And it was published by the British Chamber of Commerce. And the title is something like The Guide to the Businessman for Doing Business in Ireland.
Right.
And I look at it occasionally because it reminds me of where we were then and where we need to try and avoid ending up now.
Right, yeah.
And like you've just said, you only have to look back into even recent history to see signs of things that you want to avoid. But history also teaches you that with goodwill and imagination you can.
Is a border poll something that we have to avoid if we're to avoid making the same populist mistakes that Brexit was?
I believe that organising or planning for a border poll here in Ireland at the moment would be a profound mistake because the agenda of how we manage Brexit in so many different manifestations has to be delivered and allowed to settle on our island first. And I believe to go down the path of making the case that Irish unity is a solution to those difficulties would be a really, really profound error we should avoid on this island.
Why is that? Because some people see it as the solution.
Because I've always believed that the sequencing needs to be in the context of a settled island first. Mm-hmm. And I think it's obvious to many we're a long way away from a settled island.
And can I ask you to expand on that a little bit? Because one of the themes we keep coming back to during this series of interviews is the relationship between Ireland and England, but also the relationship we have with the unionist population. And if we are to achieve a united Ireland at some point, how we reframe that.
Yeah.
And how do you see that working? Because I know when you wrote about populism once, you said, when economic concerns fuse with identity politics, it creates, the conditions for that sort of populist revolt. And it strikes me that there are certain sort of areas in Irish life where you can say, right, this is something we should be alert to the dangers of populism in this area. And one of them is the idea that if we have 1 million people on this island who somehow we have to make feel they're going to be welcome in an agreed Ireland, and we haven't gone anywhere close to getting to that point. And
we were making progress towards that, I believe, but the consequences of the Brexit process have changed all of that. And it goes back to the earlier part of our discussion regarding the work that is to be done now, and the work we will have to devote ourselves to. Is the beauty and the wonder of the Good Friday Agreement, is that it created an architecture that was kind of nebulous enough for all to feel they had a stake in it. And it did that in truth by making some really sharp things intangible. And Brexit has made them sharp all over again. And we have to, once we get through over this bridge, through this gap, work our way through this challenge that we have approaching, we will then need to think about what has that meant for how all feel who live in this island, including, of course, the nationalist community. And then begin to think to ourselves about, is it possible to imagine a shared future? But I don't believe we're in that place at the moment. But the challenge and need is there.
We had Jared Diamond on this show a while ago, and his new book is about
collapse.
And how countries respond to crises.
Yeah.
One of the points he made is that you need to avoid self-pity as a country if you're to prosper. Do you think we've done enough around that? Is it, it's again, we have right on our side. We feel like Brexit is something, and you'll hear this repeatedly, we didn't cause Brexit. Yeah. Have we avoided self-pity in the kind of Jared Diamond analysis?
I think we have, and I think we have demonstrated our ability to move quickly as well in other recent points in our history. And I think small countries are able to do that in a way that bigger countries aren't. But I haven't read Jared Diamond's new book, but I've read some of his other stuff, and he talks about the importance of kind of geography. And, you know, many would argue that geography determines destiny as well. And that
which goes back to your other point.
And to yours as well, about our island and the proximity that we have to communities. And we have to continue to be conscious of that as we work our way through this challenge, and like we are, and the Taoiseach and Taoiseach are. I mean, I look at the Taoiseach and his level of engagement. I mean, the amount of time Simon has spent trying to play a role in getting the Good Friday institutions up and running again is unappreciated because it's such private work. And he's putting this momentous effort in for years now to try to begin the slow path to creating a public space again that all feel part of. But so we're not at all there yet.
What are the other flashpoints in your mind about for sort of a populist, a rise of populism in Ireland? Because I've heard you talk before that, like, you know, there are certain similarities between the Brexit demographic breakdown and, say, rural isolation here. Is that something, when you see what happened, you know, in the comments of TDs around Uachtarard and things like that, that you think we need to be it needs to be swift in establishing what is right and wrong in those instances.
So the kind of flashpoints that could develop there, leaving aside Brexit for a moment, would be, what if we have to deal with another horrendous economic difficulty? And I'm not talking about kind of just a recession. I'm talking about when at some point in the future the economic unknown happens again, what that would look like. And I think the other big one, which is as challenging, is the effect of climate on our island, and kind of overlapping across both is how we stand in creating a stake for all in our country who don't, for example, live in a big city. And it's something that I'm always kind of, it's always on my mind, I think, probably because I represent Dublin Central. I feel really aware of this as an issue. And you'll be aware of all of the controversy and debate earlier on in the year, and your viewers will be in relation to the National Broadband Plan and my part in all of that. But at the end of the day, the reason why I ultimately decided we needed to go ahead with it is, like, in 10 years' time, if digital connectivity and you're being able to contact public services is dependent on your access to high-speed broadband, and large parts of rural Ireland don't have that, what does that mean for them? What does it mean if we get into another phase of economic challenge and we haven't rebuilt the economic resilience of our villages and towns? And we can't let that happen. And this is why the big decision on broadband, for example, is a really important one. And it was really brought to life recently to me. I met a very senior leader from one of the biggest technology companies in the world, and he was talking about what we need to do in democracies. And the first thing he said we need to do is you have to establish digital connectivity for all.
Right.
And it really made me think about the National Broadband Plan and what that means for people who live outside a small town.
And are those divisions being, do you think there are people exploiting them at the moment?
I don't believe they are at the moment, and I believe the sense of kind of connectivity and a shared sense of national identity that we have here in Ireland is pretty resilient and pretty strong, but it's never anything that you can take for granted. And you asked me earlier on why I didn't predict Prime Minister Boris Johnson. It's a fair point. But if what that teaches me then is that I can never know what is around the corner or the challenge that you could yet come. But I also believe if you look at where we stand now and the mood that we have and the shared feeling across the country, perhaps I think it's in better conditions sometimes than we acknowledge.
But there would be people who would dispute that and feel
strongly.
It hasn't. Yeah,
there would be, and it's a charge that's put against me every day. I did leaders' questions in the Dáil earlier on in the week, and I had a pretty rowdy exchange with somebody who would disagree with me and who would argue that smaller towns and villages have been left behind, that there is too big a gap between standing in a small town in Ireland and standing in Henry Street in Dublin. I understand why that view is there. I understand why it's put to me. But I think we're making more progress in closing that gap than is acknowledged at the moment.
And yet there would be people on the other side as well who say that they can't afford to live in Dublin, that there isn't, they have to young people who can't afford to live here, who see, hotels rising and not enough being done to provide them with living spaces. So,
and we will fix that.
You will?
We will. Yeah, we will fix it. And I think the most important development that we've had in those set of economic indicators that converge so strongly with people's living standards is what is happening with house prices at the moment, and the potential, because it's too early to make this call yet, the potential for moderation. And what I would say to citizens who would challenge what I have just said about me saying we will get there is to say, let's remember where we were only a few years ago when the issue of ghost estates, when the issue of mortgage debt and bad debt and the unsustainability of vast swathes of Irish mortgage holders appeared a tsunami that was going to wash us all away. We managed to find a way through that. And I believe we will do the same again now. But of course, those words and that conviction sounds hollow for those who are living with the difficulty of today.
Or who have to emigrate.
Or who have to emigrate, yes, indeed. But it's great that we've more and more people who've come back home from the UK, people like you and me, and even younger people, dare I say it. Yeah. But it's great that has happened. But I want to see far more of it.
What's your view finally on when you see like a company like Communicore banning journalists from their stations?
I don't like to see it happen at all. And I have great respect for the journalists and presenters in Communicore. I'm on all of their shows all of the time. I think they're great. But for example, if I look at what the Currency are doing, what journalists like Ian Keogh and Tom Lyons have done, like they make life uncomfortable for people like me at times, and that's essential. It's just essential. Truth exists, and the search for truth and the debate around truth is just vital. And allowing that to flourish and making sure that we have strong diversity in broadcasting here in Ireland. And you know, your viewers will be aware again of some of the debates around RTE. That stuff's critical. In a budget a couple of years ago, I made a decision around VAT on newspapers, and I decided not to butt it up. And one of the reasons why I didn't butt it up is I look at what has happened to the decline in local media in other democracies, and what that has meant for the ability of local events to be understood. And we don't want that to happen here.
But when you see something like that, you say you don't like it, is it again, and you talk about media ownership, is that something that concerns you because the reason given is because they're a competitor, but people will be aware of history between the owner of the company and as you say, the two journalists mentioned? Like, is that something that is a way for a radio station who has a license to behave?
Well, look, the regulation of media and how it is structured here in Ireland is correctly something that I play no role in, and that should never change. And in the engagement, for example, that I would have with RTE and I would have with the Department of Communications, kind of matters of content or editorial matters can never be on the agenda and can never be discussed, because we have to maintain that gap. So look, just suffice it to say, I think that all journalists should be afforded a platform for wherever they want to go. And I look forward to seeing the day in which the journalists that we have just mentioned are on all broadcasters, giving people like me either a hard time or analysing what we're doing.
Minister, thank you so much. I know you've got the budget to prepare for. We're going to stay here and do a few more interviews in our new studio.
I'll keep an eye on who's coming in now. You actually might be able to get a lot of ministers as they're coming in and out now. So if you were ever thinking of a ministerial mini-series, now's the time to do it, Dion.
That's great. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much.
Well, that was a fascinating interview with the Minister for Finance, and thanks again to the Department for letting us into the studio, which we are reluctantly going to have to leave and hand back the power, the keys of control to the government after our brief taste of power. Anyway, before we go, please subscribe to Ireland Unfiltered on all the usual channels, and if you like the show, please leave a review.